My stepmother and father are on a honeymoon with their girls, leaving me alone. I've chosen not to let them back into my house. I'm 22 years old and the legal owner of the house I grew up in, which I inherited from my mother after she died last year at the age of 47 following a severe stroke. I have now accepted her loss. My parents separated when I was 7, and they had joint custody, so I shared my time between them. I was always closer to my mother because she actually understood me, whereas my father, who is now 50, was sometimes too preoccupied with business and other women to give me the attention I required. I was never a priority to him, but as long as I had my mother, I was fine with it. My father moved to Houston for employment a few years ago, right after I turned 18 and started college, so we saw each other less regularly and only met over the holidays. 2 years ago, he introduced us to his then-girlfriend Sarah, who is now 38. She has 2 kids, ages 18 and 16, from a prior relationship with her high school lover, with whom she broke up roughly 7 years before starting to date my father. This surprised me because my father had never brought a woman to our family gatherings before. However, we welcomed Sarah and her girls warmly and tried our best to make them feel at ease with us. It ended up being a wonderful evening. I believe we all got along nicely at the time. Even after that first meeting, whenever I called my father, Sarah would greet me, and she was always very nice to me. Her girls were quiet and introverted, so they kept to themselves most of the time, but we got along well overall. After my mother died, I discovered that she had left me the house. Fortunately, my mother had prepared her will around my 18th birthday, since she was always one to plan ahead, even in tough instances like this. Since I had just graduated, I decided to move into the house and look for a job that would not require me to relocate anytime soon. I wanted to spend the next few years in my childhood house since it provided me with comfort. My father was not pleased with my mother's decision and made it clear to me as soon as he heard about the will. He and Sarah had been extremely lovely and sympathetic during the funeral, but my father's mood darkened when he realized he wouldn't be getting the house back. This was the house my parents bought together when they were married, but my mother took over during their divorce. It was a reasonable agreement, especially since my father avoided paying alimony, despite the fact that my mother had given up her profession to stay at home and raise me, allowing my father to focus on his job. I believe maintaining the house in the deal and allowing my father to go without alimony was quite fair. My mother recovered financially with the support of her parents, and she made sure I never felt neglected or unimportant. She performed excellently in both parts, and I didn't hate the circumstances at all. My father was unhappy because he had not gotten the house back. He didn't say much about it, but I could tell by his conduct that he was unhappy. At the time, I didn't care much because I was still grieving my mother, and my father's views regarding her will were the least of my worries. She had left him all her bridal jewels and the presents he had given her, so I assumed it was enough for him. He and Sarah returned to Houston a few weeks after the funeral, and I've been living on my own ever since then. However, around 6 months ago, my father informed me that he was now engaged to Sarah and planned to marry in his hometown. He intended to return here in the weeks leading up to the wedding because staying in a hotel made little sense when there was a house with plenty of available rooms. Because her daughters were homeschooled, they would have no problems with school. I agreed and allowed them to move into my home and stay with me before the wedding for a variety of reasons. I was weary of living alone, and Sarah and I got along well, so I didn't see any reason why they shouldn't live with me. Plus, my father offered to share all of the costs while they were here, so I didn't have to worry about overpaying. So, around a month ago, they moved in with me and have been here ever since. It's been lovely having them around, and I don't feel as lonely as I did when I lived alone. I even began to believe I could get used to it and worried the day they would all depart to return to Houston. I started to worry about the day when they would return to their normal lives, knowing that it meant I would have to return to mine alone. But then, 2 weeks ago, just 3 days before the wedding, my father sat me down and asked if I would agree to let them all reside here permanently. I was really caught by surprise. He said that he had returned to make me more comfortable with the prospect of becoming a part of a family and living with him again. He didn't like the notion of me living alone in this house and had intended to gently expose me to the concept of us all living together. Now that he noticed we were getting along, he wanted to know if I was willing to make our arrangement permanent. Wanted to say yes right away, but I couldn't get beyond how devastated he was when he found out he wasn't getting the house back. As much as I enjoyed the notion of making this a permanent arrangement, I did not think it was a good idea to hurry into it. I did not want to make the error of acting just based on my feelings. Even while this looked like the perfect solution to my overpowering feelings of loneliness, I knew I didn't have to let them all live with me permanently, especially since they'd only been here for a month. So, as much as I wanted to agree, I told him I needed some time to think things through. It was only a gut sensation, but I knew I should give it some time before making a decision. I brushed aside my personal feelings and assured him I would make my decision after the wedding. He appeared disappointed but did not press the subject. They married 10 days ago, and we had a great time during the wedding. They were intended to stay here a bit longer before going back to their normal life. They intended to stay here for a few more days after the wedding before heading home, so I was preparing to tell them about my decision. However, before I could do so, they all left on their honeymoon without informing me. 2 days after the wedding, I awoke to find out completely alone the house was vacant, but many of their items were still present. I tried to contact them, but no one responded for quite some time, which added to my worries. I had planned to inform them of my decision that day, but I was unable to contact them for several hours. Finally, at noon, Sarah returned my call and nonchalantly informed me that they had all left for their honeymoon and would not be back for a week. I was surprised, as I had expected them to inform me of their plans, even if I wasn't included. I was offended that they didn't ask or disclose it to me before departing. Trying not to be petty, I inquired as to why no one had notified me, and she provided a poor answer, claiming that they had just forgotten to notify me. She encouraged me not to worry, as they would be returning shortly. I tried to explain that my worry was not that they were going on a honeymoon, but that they departed without saying anything or even a goodbye, which I felt impolite. I begged to speak with my father, but her tone switched. She said my father was busy and didn't have time to talk to me. I kept calm and asked her to let me know when he was available so that I could speak with him personally, making sure to be polite. But then, unexpectedly, she turned against me, her demeanor becoming unfriendly and aggressive. Sarah's attitude went from sweet to scathing and vicious stepmother. She said that my father would be busy for the next few days and requested me not to bother them. She also had to remind me that there was no need for me to be so upset simply because they had abandoned me and I was no longer a child. Sarah made it plain that my father had a new family, and I had to accept it. She even had the audacity to tell me that when they got home, she wanted me to stop worrying about myself and clean the house for them. I'm not sure who she thought she was talking to, but I wasn't going to let her speak to me that way. She hung up shortly after making those requests, and my rage escalated. I didn't call my father after that, and I was glad I hadn't agreed to let them live with me before witnessing this side of his new wife. There was no way they were going to stay at my house, so I packed all of their goods as carelessly as possible, placed them into a couple of cardboard boxes, and left them in the yard for them to find when they got back. I didn't care what happened to their belongings because they didn't belong to me and surely didn't belong in my home anymore. After that, I resumed my normal life, attempting not to focus on the betrayal I felt as a result of my father's actions for no apparent reason. They eventually returned from their honeymoon yesterday, and fortunately, I was at work when they discovered all of their belongings in the yard. Meanwhile, I changed the locks on the doors, preventing them from entering. My father was outraged when he called me about the matter. He accused me of being a spoiled child and overreacting, claiming that their abrupt departure was not a cause for concern and that they had done nothing wrong. I just instructed him to take his boxes and leave, and that if I discovered them on my property when I returned home, I would contact the police. He insulted me before hanging up, but I needed to get back to work and didn't want to waste time worrying about it. When I got home from work, I discovered that they had collected their belongings and left. I thought that was the end of it, but the most frustrating part was still to come. Around midnight, my father called me again, saying Sarah had something to say to me. She apologized for how she had spoken to me and modified everything she had said. She requested a second chance to make amends, claiming she did not want to be on bad terms with me over something so small. I told her to stop up and leave me alone since I didn't want her fake apologies. I'm not stupid, I could see straight through her sudden desire to play happy family now that I wasn't going to let them stay with me. If she sincerely regretted her conduct, she would not have taken so long to recognize her mistake. She would have apologized immediately following that phone call, or perhaps during their trip. I'm sure my father doesn't regret it, but when he realized I wasn't going to forgive them, he tried to play on my emotions, labeling me arrogant for refusing to let them stay. He tried to persuade me to let them move back in by offering to share all of the bills with me. He argued that he wanted to live in this house because it reminded him of my mother and that it would be selfish of me to kick them out without thinking about the impacts. He claimed he only wanted to return back to be closer to my mom. He even attempted to downplay Sarah's actions, claiming she was just having a bad day and didn't mean what she said. He also mentioned that his daughters missed me and wanted to come back and start over, but I was not going to accept any of it. I'd known my father had been watching this house since the divorce, and now that he'd seen this side of Sarah, he didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to live here. So I told him they couldn't return because I wouldn't change my decision. My father burst into tears on the phone, accusing me of being the most selfish daughter ever for refusing to let him live in the house where he'd spent the happiest days of his life. All over a simple disagreement with Sarah and the fact that they hadn't taken me on their honeymoon. He accused me of being petty and harsh, and that my mother would hate to see this side of me. Am I wrong for refusing to let my father and his new family come back in with me after his wife mistreated me and they didn't even invite me to their honeymoon? As for me, I stuck to my choice and refused to allow my father to move back in because, honestly, he did not deserve it. He has been nothing but unpleasant to me, and I do not need his negativity in my life. It was lovely while it lasted because he and Sarah were initially sympathetic to me, but when I told my father that I needed more time to think about it, their true colors began to emerge. They probably ran out of patience and assumed they could force me into letting them stay, but I'm not that weak. I'd rather be alone than spend my time with unsuitable people. Looking back, I should not have allowed them to come here at all. His reaction when he discovered that the house deed had been transferred to me rather than him should have demonstrated how greedy and selfish people can be in such situations. As for Sarah, I'm genuinely delighted she chose to quarrel with me pointlessly and ended up damaging things for herself on a grand scale. If she hadn't said those things, we may still be pretending to be a happy family, but that won't happen anymore. I will not fall for their deceptive tactics again. I was alone, missing my mother, and with all of my grandparents gone, I wanted a family who could support me. But these guys are clearly not up to the task, and I am glad I noticed it before it was too late. It's been a few days since they departed, but my father has called and texted me frequently. Because I'm not returning his calls, he believes I should give them one final chance to rectify things. But they don't deserve it. They wasted their only opportunity, and if I offer them another, I'm confident they'll squander it as well, which would have the most impact on me. So it makes no sense to take that risk. I feel awful for treating my father this way, but there isn't much I can do in this position. You get what you sow, and in his case, he never cared to foster our relationship when he had the opportunity. My father never made any effort with me, so he has no right to complain when he sees I'm not going to base my life decisions on his feelings. He never did this for me. It turns out my father is not just insistent, but also anxious to move in with me. And here's why. He didn't take a sabbatical from work, as he stated. He got fired a few months before the wedding. He's been living off his sizable savings, but after spending on a lavish wedding and a luxurious vacation, those finances have now run out. Now he's told Sarah that they can't afford to return to Houston and try their luck there since he can't pay the rent. And Sarah abandoned her work to be a housewife after meeting my father, so she can't help either. They're now in a situation where they need to find a place to stay, and my father expected I'd let them live with me. Sarah was fully oblivious to their financial situation until my father revealed the truth to her, which explains why she didn't repent earlier. She had no genuine sorrow for her actions. I was right about her. She's as false as they come, but she appears to be the type of wife my father deserves. He contacted me again today, asking if they might move in for a few days until he could find a decent job that would allow them to move forward. But I assured him I wouldn't do that. They have been terrible to me, and I do not need that kind of negativity in my life. He's an adult. If he didn't have a job, he shouldn't have planned such a luxurious wedding and honeymoon. I understand the need for celebration, but not at the expense of your future. Displaying money is acceptable if you can afford it, but that is not the case for a man with a housewife and 2 teenage stepdaughters. He was completely aware of his responsibilities but decided to ignore them, which is not my fault. I refuse to feel bad about putting myself first. They can handle it on their own because none of this is my responsibility anymore. I texted him and stated the same concerns I've made here, but I attempted to be more polite to avoid coming across as sarcastic. However, he saw it as ridiculous and told me I would have to suffer for what I was doing to him. I had no idea how to respond to that, so I didn't. At this point, no matter what I say, he'll find a way to distort it and blame me, so I'd rather say nothing and let him deal with his own problems. It's not really my problem right now. My father chose to leave the city today, but he couldn't do so without telling me how disappointed he is in me as his daughter. He could have departed quietly, but that is not who he or his wife is. Instead, they decided to make a spectacle of it. I last chatted with him around 3 weeks ago, and we haven't spoken since. He didn't bother contacting me either. But today, both he and Sarah emailed me, happily informing me that Sarah's ex-boyfriend had chosen to support their travel back home and would even let them stay with him because he had suddenly realized he wanted to see his daughters as well. Sarah has complete custody. Sarah had full custody of her girls, and her ex paid child support, but he was always too busy to devote time to them. He left Sarah and my father to figure things out on their own for a time, but when he saw they were struggling, he stepped in to clean up the mess, at least for the sake of his daughters. It's encouraging that some fathers come up, even if it's late. They didn't tell me everything explicitly, but I can piece things together. They shared a picture of their girls with a lucky clover and a 4-leaf clover sticker as the caption a few hours ago, so I can imagine what's causing Sarah's ex's sudden enlightenment and why he's paying for their return trip. I don't understand why he would pay for all of their aircraft tickets, but I believe Sarah's manipulation and stubbornness were a factor. I have seen that side of her before, so I know she is capable of it. Whatever happened, I'm pleased they're leaving and that this is the last time I'll have to deal with them. After reading some of the stories posted here about their own weird families, I realize how fortunate I am in contrast. My father is too concerned about his reputation to try anything that could harm me since he knows I would never hesitate to call the police. I have enough training to protect myself, therefore I am not concerned. And now that they're departing, I've got even less reason to think about them. So, hooray for me, I suppose. I still feel lonely at times, but rather than dwelling on it, I've begun to seek support from my friends. In cases like this, I believe that is a far superior course of action. After my mother passed away, I completely withdrew myself and had no idea how lonely I had gotten. It will take some time, but I am determined to make the most of my life now. I have a stable job, a decent income, and own my own home, something not everyone my age can claim, and I'm grateful to my mother for that. I also have wonderful friends who actually care about me. And what else does a person need? Today, I received an unexpected call from my father. Perhaps not so unexpected, given that he had been attempting to contact me via messages, social media, and phone calls, but I had declined to speak with him. I finally responded since I was curious why he was so demanding. I just wanted him to quit harassing me. We hadn't spoken in several months, so I knew this chat would be interesting, to say the least. Hearing his voice after so long was surprising, but it immediately changed to shock when he informed me Sarah had opted to reconcile with her ex, the same one who paid for their return trip home. Apparently, things did not work out as planned with my father, so she chose to restart her prior relationship. My father was in shock and sadness, and he appeared to sincerely apologize for everything that had transpired. He asked for the opportunity to reconcile and rebuild our relationship. However, after everything he and Sarah had put me through, I couldn't help but feel indifferent. I I'd experienced enough stress and pain as a result of their actions, and I didn't want to bring them back into my life. I told him I was sorry, but I had already made my decision and had no plans to change it. Even though I could hear the despair in his voice, I maintained my position. I couldn't simply disregard the hurt they'd caused me. My father has continued to try to contact me since then, but I have decided